In this episode, the featured film is a traditional Hollywood musical made at the time of the golden age of Hollywood musicals. It contains two iconic scenes that I think are as famous as any two scenes ever made in movies, and it has a storyline that is better than your typical Hollywood musical in that it talks about the beginning of talking pictures. These stories and more from the 22nd row. Singin' in the Rain was released in 1952. It's a traditional musical and a period piece. The time of the film is 1927, and the location is Los Angeles, specifically Hollywood. Singin' in the Rain tells the story of the end of silent films and the beginning of talking pictures, and it does so in a fun way in the genre of song and dance. Now, by 1952, Hollywood had been making musicals for over 20 years, such that the talent pool, the level of expertise, everything had reached a tremendous peak during this period, such that I call it, I don't know if other people do, the golden age of Hollywood musicals. The 50s were really remarkable. There were so many wonderful films that I've enjoyed, of which Singin' in the Rain is a classic example. Now, I'm a huge fan of musicals, especially traditional musicals. Why? Well, like everybody, I can sing. Everybody sings. I'm not any good at it. I'm a pretty terrible singer. I don't know if I ever was a good singer, but I'm not now, that's for sure. But I like singing. And in my salad days, I wasn't a bad dancer, and I danced in front of crowds. And though the memory of those days in the sun is all I have left, for all my life I've enjoyed watching either in person or on the silver screen dancing. I just think it's fantastic, and because I've danced a little, I really like dancing. So, what is a traditional Hollywood musical? I've talked in previous episodes about non-traditional musicals, but now I'm going to talk about Singin' in the Rain, which is a traditional Hollywood musical. And it is unique to this genre that the traditional musical is kind of different. Two people are sitting at a kitchen table, or let's say you're in a coffee shop or something, and they're talking, and all of a sudden they start singing to each other, and maybe they even start dancing with each other or dancing alone. Now, that is not normal everyday behavior. That is behavior that you find within the traditional musical genre. And you either like that and enjoy the way the story is told using these things, or you don't. And I like it very much. Now, I had a friend who told me about the first time he saw a Hollywood musical. And he said, I'm watching this movie, and these two people are walking down the street, and all of a sudden they start singing to each other, and then they start dancing. It was so stupid, I hated it. So I stopped watching it. I've never watched a movie like that since. Musicals aren't for everyone. You gotta like it. But for me, I like it. It is for me. So, Singin' in the Rain not only has fabulous song and dance numbers, it also has an excellent story to tell. And that story is when silent films were dying and talking pictures were taking over. There were a lot of challenges to be faced during this transitional period, and Singin' in the Rain takes a look at them, takes a poke at them with a lot of fun and a lot of humor, and of course a lot of music and a lot of dancing. And that's what I like about the film. But at this period in 1927, it was a difficult time for the movie business on the one hand. They had experienced at least 10 years, if not more, of fabulous movie making. The silent era, the pantomime films of between 1915 and 1925 were spectacular. They had reached a level that created excellent films, stylized film, and had generated enormous stars. I mean superstars. If you picture that this was a visual medium, not a talking medium, but purely a visual medium, then the scope of these films was the entire planet. The stars that were created during this period were known all over the world. There were two such stars, long forgotten, I'm sure, except by serious music people, or maybe people who just like watching lots of films. They're not serious. They were Mary Pickford and her husband, Douglas Fairbanks. Now, they were two of the biggest stars of the silent era, sadly long forgotten, such is life. But in the early 20s, they went to Russia, at that time the Soviet Union. Now, this was about 5 years after the Soviet Revolution, so this was a society definitely in flux. But when they got to the Soviet Union, they were invited by the Russian Soviet government. They were swarmed by thousands upon thousands of people. All of them knew who these two stars were. And the scholars have said, anywhere on the planet where there was a theater that could show a movie, the silent pictures were king, and the stars of the silent films were known all over the globe. So picture Soviet Russia just a few years after the revolution, and these two American stars were swarmed. So that was the reach of silent films. They had reached a point of expertise. The films are fantastic. Yes, you have to acquire a taste for them, and in the next episode I'm going to talk about one of those films. But they were at the peak of their popularity, let's say 1925. At the same time, the studio heads were aware that the storm clouds were forming, and those storm clouds were sound pictures. The technology had been improving year after year, and of course everybody knew that sound and film at one point were going to come together, but was talking pictures going to be a thing? Well, the studio heads, not fools, they were incredibly wealthy because silent pictures were so popular, but they were aware that talking pictures might be on the horizon. Would they be a fad, or would they be real? A real thing? It was hard to say. But the studio heads had to realize that if they were to change to talking pictures, it would be an enormous cost to them. Why? Because there wasn't a single theater in the world that could project a talking picture. All of the pictures were silent. So they would have to retrofit every theater in the world to allow for talking pictures. And what if they decided to do this and talking pictures had turned out to be a fad, and people went to see them and they went, they're not nearly as good as silent films, so we're going to stop with our participation talking pictures, and we're going to go back to the silence. The studio heads weren't sure, so they didn't do anything. But the smallest studio, Warner Brothers, wanted to become a big player, and so they were in a position to take more risks than the big studios. So it was Warner Brothers that produced and released a film in 1927, a talking picture, and it wasn't really very talky. It was more silent than talky, but it was there was talking in it, and there was singing in it. And that picture, released in 1927, was The Jazz Singer. Would it be a fad? Would it take off? Would it signal the end of the silent era and the beginning of talking films? Nobody knew at the time, but very soon they knew. The Jazz Singer was a roaring success and only got bigger and bigger every month that it was open to the public. The silent era was on its last legs, and talking pictures had arrived. So, 1927, 1928, talking pictures were here to stay. Silent films were on the way out. But another group beside the studios were in trouble with the advent of talking pictures, and that group were the actors and actresses. So picture 1926, silent films. Anyone could be in a silent movie if they had that it, as I talked about before, that it that meant that they had screen presence, that the camera loved them, that they were stars, or even co-stars, but the screen loved them. Didn't matter what language they spoke, didn't matter what country they came from, if they could act and they could carry the screen, they were stars. But with talking pictures, and with Hollywood being the dominant producer of films, but even in the late 20s, that might change 10 years from then, but in the late 20s, Hollywood was still the dominant producer of films. If they were going to make talking pictures, those pictures were going to be in English. So any stars, male or female, who didn't speak English or whose English was a second language, they were in trouble. And in fact, some careers ended overnight. Actors and actresses whose English was so poor they could not continue. Other actors and actresses whose English was a second language, who couldn't speak English very well, they faded away slowly. They might have had 1 or 2 or 3 more pictures, smaller roles, to where they disappeared too. And that was one of the crushing blows of the talking era, that some great stars disappeared overnight. So what about the ones that were left, the English speakers? Well, 2 things. One is the English speakers had to improve their speaking skills, certainly, had to learn how to act with microphones, and so they went to voice lessons and elocution lessons and any kind of lessons that allowed them to act around microphones. And the other group, who could speak English but not very well, they really had to ramp up their English, and they were in trouble as well. So the problem was that the microphones were very primitive at this time, and so the ability to speak well and the ability to navigate the film with these microphones was very, very challenging. And so there was a, how would you say it, there was a period where these films that were produced were not very good, if we can put the nicest shine on that as possible. The early talking pictures were just a shadow of what the silent films were. The silent films in 1925-26 had reached a level that was unprecedented. They were fabulous films with lots of camera work and huge stars. They really had figured out how to tell a story with images. Then when that stopped and talking pictures took over, they had a static microphone and a static camera, and the pictures looked awful. The microphones didn't work very well, such that they didn't pick up the voices properly, or they picked up sounds that they weren't supposed to pick up. Like if I scratch my shirt, I don't know if it reflected in the mic I have under my tie, but things like that would happen, and that was definitely not a good thing. Then at the camera. The camera was loud. In the silent era, loud cameras didn't matter. There was no sound being recorded, so the cameras were loud, the directors were yelling at people, there was noise everywhere. It didn't matter. But when you start recording sound, every sound matters, every noise matters. The cameras were loud, so they had to be put into booths. And these small booths were soundproofed, and the camera goes in there, and now 2 things happened. One is they got hot and they were claustrophobic, and there were many stories of directors of photography or cameramen passing out from the heat in these booths, and also the camera didn't move. The pictures were very static. And so what happened? What happened was you had a static image on the screen with a lot of talking and not much else. And so after the novelty of talking wore off, and there were a lot of early films made with talk, 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 and audiences loved that, we got talking pictures. It didn't take long for audiences to get tired of it. The fad was over. The pictures were very poor quality, and the audiences started saying that we don't like this at all. So what did they do? The studios had to respond. They had to come up with better pictures, just as they'd done between 1910 and 1915 when movies had started out, and the early silent films were not bad, but they were rough. But by 1915, the expertise had improved, the talent pools were bigger. They started to figure out how to tell stories using visual images. And between 1916 and 1925, they really became expert at the ability to tell a story through visual images. So Hollywood responded very, very quickly, really. I mean, just a few years. The same thing happened in the early 30s. They went from very bad films, or the quality was very poor, the techniques were outdated as fast as they had begun, the microphones, the tech side of it were all bad, to the point where they got better microphones, better techniques, better cameras. The actresses and actors learned how to navigate the world of microphones and relatively static cameras. The movies started to get better. But what really made the difference was a new genre that was perfectly suited to sound, and that was the musical. Now, why was the musical such a big hit? Well, it's simple. We're talking about sound pictures, and as soon as talking became tiresome, and the audiences said, that's not enough, we want more, in comes the musical with what? Lots of music, lots of sound, lots of singing, lots of dancing, lots and lots of singing, and lots of dancing. So musicals became a phenomenon. They couldn't make them fast enough, and the audiences filled the theaters. They wanted musicals and more and more and more. And so the musical became a huge sensation in the 30s, such that year in and year out, some of the most successful films of every year were musicals, as opposed to some very good dramas that were made in the 30s, gangster films, historical dramas. They were all well-done films, but the musical was king. And Hollywood just pumped and pumped and pumped out musicals every year. Now, that led to a huge demand for talent. So, of course, stage actors and actresses who had trained voices flocked to Hollywood. And all across America, again, which at one time began in the 1910 to 1915, you want to get into pictures, you go to Hollywood. If you think you have some talent, maybe good looking, because everybody in Hollywood has to be good looking. Now, in the early 30s, the stage actors flocked to Hollywood, and anyone who thought they could sing and dance and was pretty flocked to Hollywood. So there was an enormous talent pool, and the expertise had improved, so the musical exploded in the 30s. But there was one more hurdle for Hollywood to overcome, and that hurdle was the stars. Now, Hollywood has always been about stars, as I said, from the silent era, where the stars of the silent movies were known all over the world. They could have gone to Mongolia, and if there was a movie theater in a city in Mongolia that played films, chances are they were Hollywood films, and the people in that country would know these great stars because they were larger than life and they were known throughout the world. So Hollywood had known right from day one that stars sell movies. So the audiences wanted musicals, which meant the stars, the biggest stars of every studio, had to appear in musicals. Yes, there were other films, and they did very well in these other films, but if the #1 genre was musicals, they had to get their big names into these musicals. So what's the problem? The problem is, what if these stars couldn't sing and dance? Well, they had to teach them, and part of the studio system for the next 20 years was everybody they signed had to go through the studio classroom, which is how to sing, how to dance, how to dress, how to put on makeup, how much weight to put on or take off. They really molded their actors and actresses into what they thought would sell. So they have these big stars, either from the end of the silent era or from the early talkies, and there were some very big stars, but they had to put them in musicals. What if they couldn't sing and dance? Well, there's an argument that dancing can be taught. Now, not to be experts at it, but passable. And there's an argument that says that singing can be taught, but it's really hard to get people to the singing level of the expertise required in a musical. So a lot of actors who had stuck their toe into the waters of musicals and left, and there's many famous ones that had maybe did 1 or 2 musicals at most and then left to do other things. But singing was a problem, and voices were a problem, because if their voices, they spoke English, but they were very accented, or they spoke too high or spoke too low, that was a problem. And if they couldn't sing, and the argument is you can teach somebody to dance a little bit, but you can't teach anybody to sing well. If you can, let me know and I'll sign up. Then there was a problem, because they had to put these stars in these pictures. So what was the solution? And again, Hollywood, to its everlasting credit, came up with a solution. Dub the voice. The lip sync was born. Now, I don't know when this happened or who started it or what year it happened. All I know is that pretty early on, if the star that they had to put in this picture, because everybody knew the star or starlet, couldn't sing, then someone else would sing, and they would dub that voice over the star's or starlet's voice, and the star or starlet would lip sync it. And that practice has existed from the early 30s right up until the present day. They still do it. For example, I saw a movie not too long ago. It was released in 2005, which is not 1930, 1940, it's not even 1950, 2005. And it was a Franco-German production called Joyeux Noël, which was a story about the First World War, the trenches where the Germans and the French were facing each other, and there was an operatic husband and wife who would sing to the troops to make them feel better, you know, a break or something, Christmas time. Now the actor and actress in this movie, neither of them could sing, or could sing well enough, so they used operatic singers to sing the songs that they sang in the movie, and their voices were dubbed. So even in 2005, Hollywood, not Hollywood in this case, it was European films, were doing the same thing. They were replacing voices, singing voices, with other people. So the problem was that these very excellent singers of the 30s, 40s, and 50s were getting lots of work, but they weren't recognized. In fact, Hollywood, I think, strove to keep it a secret that your screen star, your screen idol that everybody loved, wasn't actually singing the music or the songs that they were singing. It wasn't until much later, much after this period, that now if you go on the internet and research any of these films, it will tell you exactly who sang the songs, and it's very good at how detailed they are, and say, no, in fact, it was this person, not that person, and this person sang in many songs of the period. So I hope that they were well compensated. Eventually they were acknowledged, hopefully before they passed on, but this was how Hollywood brilliantly satisfied the need to put stars on screen even if they couldn't sing, because the musical was king and they had to put them in these pictures. So that was the last hurdle. The voices, the acting, the technical problems, the cameras, all of these elements are focused on in Singin' in the Rain in a very funny and amusing way, and as I said, in a very well-natured way, especially the voices. And in fact, the voice element is a central plot line in Singin' in the Rain. I'll just leave it at that, but that is very much what goes on. So, that's what Singin' in the Rain is about. It talks about all these problems, and as I say, especially the voice problem, and there's an enormous amount of comedy, the stage for comedy in this, and also for some tremendous singing, and also for people to see, well, how did they do it, and what was it really like to have somebody singing on the one hand and never ever being acknowledged as that singer. And Singin' in the Rain is very much the story about how that took place. But Singin' in the Rain is also about much, much more, and it's about song and dance numbers. When they talk about the history of the talking pictures, they're also talking about the rise of the leading man and the leading ladies. And so there's many wonderful song and dance numbers that start relatively 5 minutes into the film. There's a terrific song and dance number. But there are two numbers in this film that, as I said, are the most iconic, I think, as iconic as any numbers in, not numbers, any scenes in any picture ever made. Anyone who's seen a few films and knows a little bit about earlier films, the films that I talk about, will know that these scenes are famous. If you talk to a movie buff, yeah, do you know that scene in Singin' in the Rain? Of course I know that scene. The first scene occurs early in the film. It's just a few minutes in, and it's the buddy of the leading man telling him how to tell a story through humor. He says, my dad told me that to tell a good story, you have to do it with humor. Now, that is the simple premise that leads to a, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 minute long sequence of a song and dance number done exclusively by this actor. His name, again, lost to the mists of time. His name was Donald O'Connor. A good singer, but a brilliant dancer. The technique, the skill level of this gentleman is, I think, just remarkable. But the scene is terrific, and I'm going to tell a story about this. In my 20s, I went to see Singin' in the Rain in a local repertory theater. And at that time, there were many, many such theaters in the sweet old town that I'm from that showed, did not show current films, but showed older films. And it catered to 20-something crowds because they were cheap. You know, it wasn't the usual price to get into a film. It was much cheaper. So I went one night to see Singin' in the Rain. I don't know if it was the first time I'd seen the movie or the second time. I can't remember, but it was very early on. And I was in this packed house with people 20-somethings like myself, and I just got a sense that there was an expectation of failure, that there was a real skepticism with everyone, that we're here because there's been so much told to us about this film and what's all the fuss about, but really we're pretty much expecting it to be a dud. Now I think I might have seen the film and I liked it, but I'd never seen it in the theater. But that was what the expectation was, that this very, I don't want to say jaded, but this 20-something crowd weren't expecting much. So the movie starts, and there's some good scenes at the beginning, some great song and dance numbers at the beginning, and then fairly early on, this scene begins. The buddy says, to tell a good story, you have to use humor. And so for 4 or 5 minutes, the scene goes on. There's dancing, there's singing, there's all the things in the scene that make it what it is. And when it was done, the audience exploded. The applause, the roaring, the standing up, everybody in that theater went crazy, such that they kept going crazy well into the next scene of the movie, which nobody, of course, heard or could hear a word of it. It was remarkable, and I was one of those people that stood up and cheered. It was just incredible. I guess speaking to the power of film, the power of traditional musicals, because again, there's so much talent on display. How many people can dance like that? Yeah, I think there might be a lot of people who have decent singing voices, but how many people can dance like what you see in a Hollywood musical? It's incredible. So that's the first scene. Now later in the film, there's another scene. And this scene follows the romance story arc. So let's just say that the romance is going in the right direction, and our lead man is pretty happy about things. And so what he does, as is traditional in all these Hollywood musicals, is he's going to sing about it. And in fact, he sings the title song of the movie, Singin' in the Rain, which, by the way, was written in 1929, but the production of it was upped for a 1952 audience. It was a very different way the song was done in the movie. So he sings the song, and he literally sings and dances in the rain. And I'll just kind of leave it at that, but there's, in addition to the singing, there's some dancing involved, and I think as much as the first scene is iconic and very memorable, this one is very, very famous. And the actor's name is Gene Kelly, who also co-directed the film. And he had done many musicals up to the point of 1952 and was to do a few more. But this was, I think, his crowning achievement, was this film. And anyone who knows movies knows this sequence, and in fact it's referenced even by people who haven't seen it. Oh yeah, that Singin' in the Rain, that part where he sings in the rain. But it's wonderful. Had the same reaction that the audience had for the first scene, iconic scene. It is just a magic moment in motion picture history. And again, the talent involved, the way it was staged, how much fun it is, the joy in this scene is just wonderful. And I'll leave it at that. If I was, as I am recommending Singin' in the Rain as a movie to see, I would say that even if there's a lot of things in this movie you're not really keen on, you're new to traditional musicals, and it's hard to kind of get past some of the things that they do, I enjoy them all, but I appreciate that it might be not these two scenes. If you want to watch this film, it is worth these two scenes alone. You might say, the movie, but boy, those two scenes were incredible, and that's, for me, worth watching. Now, as I said, the film was released in 1952, and for some reason, the people who were responsible for the film, Gene Kelly and others, decided that they needed to do something contemporary, to make a film within the film, which is what the story is about. It's about taking a silent film and making it into a musical, eventually. They wanted to add a piece that I guess would keep the audience happy, because we're about 90% of the way into the film. And so he does this. What if we did this scene, is how they set it up, and then they create this fantasy kind of piece that lasts about 5 minutes long. It has nothing to do with the storyline of the film. It's just a performance piece, but it's Gene Kelly, again, demonstrating his incredible talent to dance, because it's music and dance and very little singing, but it's mostly music and dance. And another person, an actress, again, sadly lost to the mists of time, Sid Charisse, who was a spectacular dancer and very, very eye-catching. She was tall, slender, exotic looking, She was an icon of the 50s. But they did this 4 or 5 minute dream sequence, sort of, and it's a lot of fun. It's great to watch. It isn't really connected to the rest of the movie, but it's a traditional Hollywood musical, and they wanted one more big number before the movie ended, and they put it in. And it's just, all I can say is it's a whole lot of fun, and these people are incredibly talented, and that talent is on display. So the movie ends with tying up some loose ends in the plot. There's a few more minutes left after this sequence, and that is Singin' in the Rain. Catchy tunes, tremendous song and dance, and absolutely a shining example of the traditional Hollywood musical. At least that's what Singin' in the Rain looks to me from the 22nd row.